The Assad regime has collapsed. The president, gone.
Bashar al-Assad
is no longer Syria's dictator. He's now in exile in Moscow.
As rebels moved into the Syrian capital of Damascus.
Rebel forces launched a devastating series of attacks from their tiny stronghold of Idlib province, marching east into Aleppo, then south to Hama, through Homs, and finally to Damascus. And they did it in less than 2 weeks. I'll show you how. Now, first things first, we've done our best to understand this story based on a whole range of sources, from experts we've spoken to, from other media, from human rights groups, and from Syrians who are on the ground, living the conflict in real time. Not all of it we can independently verify ourselves, and where that's the case, I'll do my best to make that clear. But this was one of the earliest moments that the world saw just what was unfolding.
وهي ابو عبد الراجمه في قلب المشعل في عنجاره لينا ومال البيت الاسد.
In that clip, we see a man praying by a statue in a town rebel groups claimed to have conquered. The cameraman is saying roughly, Anjara is ours. Now, I should say, this is unverified video, posted late last month by a freelance journalist who's covering the conflict. But those coordinates take us here, where we can see that statue from above, and that this is indeed in the heart of Anjara. The city matters because it was the front doorstep of what would become the opposition forces' first major victory, where the world would be reintroduced to a rebel group called
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Or HTS for short.
HTS.
HTS.
Known as HTS.
For years, HTS forces had been marshalling in Idlib province, considered the last remaining opposition stronghold against Assad's regime in the country. Until they pushed east. Cities like Kaptan al-Jabal and Anjara were among the first to fall. HTS and its allies claimed to capture at least 13 villages, as well as a Syrian army base in about a day. Within the next 24 hours, we began to see reports of rebels capturing not just land, but weapons. This Syrian rebel group commander posted on November 28th. During our operations, we were able to seize 12 tanks, 2 BMP vehicles, those are Russian armored infantry vehicles, 6 machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank missiles. Now, it's impossible for us to verify any of those claims, but one day later, those opposition forces would breach the western limits of Aleppo, their first major prize of the offensive. Government forces reportedly fled. By evening Friday, November 29th, CNN reported that the city center had fallen, and rebel forces grew even stronger, continuing to claim Syrian army weapons as their own. We haven't been able to independently verify that video, but I'll explain what it claims to show. It was posted by the head of the Middle East Institute's Syria program, based in Washington. And those weapons, he claims, are man-portable rocket launchers meant to shoot down planes. Because at this point, you might be wondering, how did rebel forces advance so quickly and successfully? And where was the Syrian National Army? Well, there was an attempt to fight back. As rebels broke into Aleppo, Russian planes, an ally of Syria, dropped bombs on Idlib, the rebels' home base. This is the aftermath of an airstrike on a hospital. Several others were hit too, including a maternity hospital. But Russia has been in no position to fully commit to a defense of Syria because it's busy fighting a war in Ukraine. Iran is another close ally of Syria, but its major proxy, Hezbollah, has been decimated by Israel in its war against Hamas.
And so the Iranians really weren't very willing to put their own troops on the ground to back the Assad regime.
And this weakened backbone of defense would continue to show glaring cracks as opposition forces marched south. The M5 highway in Syria goes a long way in literally connecting the dots of how rebels eventually broke the Assad government. It connects Aleppo, which opposition forces had just conquered, to Hama in the south, then further to Homs, and finally to Syria's capital of Damascus. Hama is where the Syrian army would attempt to draw a line. On December 1st, as rebels pushed south, Syria's defense minister announced that a large group of reinforcements would bolster a defensive position just north of that city. Around this time, Syria's close ally, Iran, claims it was coordinating with Russia to decide how to help. According to some local media, the three countries would agree on a series of phone calls that something had to be done to counter what they called the spread of terrorism. But that help was either slow to come, ineffective, or both, because over the next several days, rebel forces, by this point, a coalition of different groups, all seizing the moment, they pushed deep into Hama.
Releasing prisoners it says were wrongly detained from the city's main prison.
By this point, it was starting to become clear that opposition forces had a kind of unstoppable momentum. Pro-opposition media posted this footage, reportedly, but unverifiably, showing a convoy of HTS coalition fighters preparing to travel south on the M5 highway from Hama to Homs, which you can think of as the gateway to the capital, Damascus.
It's the third largest city in Syria, and it's positioned right along a strategic highway which goes north and south, and basically would have made it impossible to continue to supply Syrian military forces and components to the west.
Many experts saw losing Homs as the start of a death spiral for the Assad regime. It is the site of a key oil refinery, a major economic hub, and, as you heard, a connection point to the coast. It would also appear to have been the last shred of hope for defenders of Bashar al-Assad. Because as Homs fell, rebels called on regime soldiers to defect.
والانشقاق عن هذه العصابة التي ربطت مصير شعب بأكمله بمصير أفراد العائلة الحاكمة وإلا فانتظروا مصيركم.
It's impossible to know how many did, but they did run. Iran flew their officers out, and by the time opposition forces began their final push for Damascus itself, there was effectively nobody left to stop them. They seized the capital unopposed. Bashar al-Assad, the man who ruled Syria with an iron fist, had disappeared.
It was clear that the security forces and the Syrian regime's military forces were simply washed away. And it created a further constraint and obstacle for security forces to control large crowds.
The Syrian army had no stomach for this fight. They defected, they had surrendered, they retreated.
In the end, there were at least three big reasons Assad's regime fell. It was weak without its allies. It was up against a coalition of forces who appeared to coordinate, at least on some level. And it was unpopular.
The Syrian regime has been in power for 50 years, and yet it fell. I can tell you that the moment we are living today, freedom of the Assad regime, it's worth all the pain, all the suffering, all the fear, all the disappointment, all the betrayal. It's worth everything.
But a much more difficult question to answer now is what or who takes Bashar al-Assad's place? HTS, which led the rebellion, is a jihadi group with roots in al-Qaeda. For years, it has been labeled a terrorist group by the US, the EU, and the UN. That might change now, given what's happened. But it's anyone's guess what happens next.